summer in 1998, we were asked to put up our display of Pocahontas exhibition in the church, and many more visitors have been this year, which is really good. And quite a lot of our visitors, 1,000 altogether, have actually sent us other items to go in the display. And this is some of the actual information we've received about John Smith. You need to remember that there are two Johns in the story. John Smith is the man from Lincolnshire who was born in a village called Willoughby. And John Rolfe is the person who actually married Pocahontas, who was born in this village and whose parents and family are buried in our church here. So all this information here is the first John, John Smith. This has actually come from a little museum at Alford, very close to Willoughby village, which was where John Smith was born. And John Smith was taken on Saturday the 9th of January 1580 by his parents George and Alice Smith to be baptised in Willoughby Church. And these are the beautiful windows that you can see in Willoughby Church today, remembering the story of how he married, how he met Pocahontas and how she saved his life. And this is the plaque that is being positioned outside the pub, called the Willoughby Arms. And also in the church there are two flags. There's the American flag and the British flag of that time. And it says here on the plaque, "To the memory of Captain John Smith, who was baptised in this church on the 9th of January 1579, in brackets, the 19th of January 1580, new style." That's interesting because millennium is coming up soon in the year 2000, so there is an old date and a date which coincides with our millennium calendar. He was the first among the leaders of the settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, which began the expansion overseas of the English-speaking people, the Commonwealth of Virginia, the United States of America, and the British Commonwealth of Nations. This plaque was erected in 1960 by the Jamestown Foundation of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, he did go back to America very briefly. After his leg was blown up, he came back to England on the ship. He did try to go back to America, and I believe he went back with some of the folks from the Pilgrim Fathers from Boston in Lincolnshire. But he didn't actually settle in America, he only visited. And his main work then became based in London, where he was a writer for many years, and there are many of his books still around in our archives today, and he is known as a famous writer. He was also a rope builder, made lots of ships, ropes and knots and so on, and he was very expert at making navigation charts. He died in 1600, no, when did he die? Hold on. Can't see. 1631, I think he died. Yes, on June the 21st he died in London, and he was buried in a church opposite the Old Bailey called St Sepulchre without Newgate. It's just around the corner from St Paul's Cathedral. And this church was damaged during the fire of London in 1666, but was redecorated in the style of Sir Christopher Wren, and it's very beautiful. It isn't used now, it's mainly locked up, but they have had recently a very beautiful window put in the back in 1968. This was presented by the family of Bradford Smith, who is a descendant of John Smith. It was designed by Francis Skeet, and as you can see it's got Captain John Smith in the centre and others who went out in those early expeditions and settled the colony in Jamestown. And he's buried in the church somewhere. There is apparently a very large bronze bust statue of John Smith in the law courts just around the corner from the Old Bailey, but I haven't actually got a photograph of that. This summer, a gentleman from Peterborough came over to the village called Mr. Rick Lasserve, who used to live in our village for many, many years. And he was very, very interested in the story of Pocahontas. And I think about 20 years ago, he took his family on a visit to America and took these photographs. Now, when the first ship went out to America, it landed at this beach here, which they named Cape Henry, after the son of King James I. And as you can see, there's a cross on the beach, which is a memorial site of where they had their first communion service, celebrating their safe arrival on that very first ship. They then travelled up the river, and they found a spot which is now known as College Creek, or Archer's Hope Creek, because Captain Gabriel Archer thought this would be a very perfect spot to build the settlement. And they had a long discussion about whether they should or whether they shouldn't. And they took a vote on it. But Captain Smith, Archer rather, he was actually outvoted by the other crew members who wanted to carry on further up the river to a more sheltered area. And so they eventually moved further up the river to this spot here, where they built the little town and where their ships were anchored. But this spot is still marked because they then decided to build a college there. And I believe the Americans who visited us this summer told me the story that the college was burnt down by the Indians. But the land is still owned by the university now. And there is a plaque to remind them about that first university that was destroyed about the end of the century, in about 1795. No, it would be 1695, wouldn't it? There they go. Yeah, they went in 60. They actually built the university at Williamsburg, William and Mary University. Okay, that's up it there. Now, Mr. Lasserve, as I said, was very interested in the Indians, and he has a beautiful book about the 500 nations of Indian tribes. And we found these two very nice pictures, which are actually paintings, I believe, in America. This is showing the James Fort as it was when they first built it, in June the 15th, 1607. And they've actually reconstructed the whole village in America now, exactly as it was. And then also in the same book, we found a very nice picture of how they had their Indian village nearby in the woods. And you can see the shape of the houses. And they were very organised with their plantation area and their worshipping area, the gods they used to worship, the cooking areas, and so on. And I believe that is the same tribe as Powhatan's tribe. He was actually a very famous leader of the Indians, Powhatan, and he had a sort of territory that was very large, with 32 tribes in his group of Indians. Now this picture here is from the same book, and it is a very nice painting, a 19th century painting, which is showing how John Smith and Christopher Newport, who were the two leaders of the colony at that time, presenting a crown from King James to the leader of the Indians, Chief Powhatan, who was Pocahontas' father, in a sort of a ceremony recognising that he was the power as head of the Powhatan Confederacy. And apparently in exchange at that time, Powhatan then gave the English colonists his cloak here, which is displayed in a museum at Oxford, in one of the very old museums in the town of Oxford in England. We actually had a visit this summer from a lady and her husband who actually are connected with this museum, and they have given us a postcard of the actual object and explain where to find it in the museum. And I'll go on to talk about the glass now. Yeah? Give me a thumbs up when we're ready to go. Now, Mr. Lasserve has also given us some very interesting leaflets that he collected from the Jamestown Museum in America, in the USA, showing how they tried to make things out of glass. They had a special house where this all took place, and they built furnaces, and they melted the sand and tried to create different types of glass pottery, glass objects rather, which they then attempted to export back to England. It was one of their first industries of the New World, and it took place 1608 to 09, and then again they tried later from 1621 to 24, but they weren't really very successful because the Dutch people in Europe actually were making far superior glass at a much cheaper price and didn't have the expense of shipping it across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, back to England to be sold, and so it was a very non-competitive enterprise and didn't make them any money and was abandoned in 1624. But the actual furnaces are still there now. You can still see the remains of them on the site in Jamestown. And they have in their living museum people dressed up showing how they were making the glass and turning it on these long glass tubes, blowing the glass bottles in very much the same way that they still use glass blowing in Kings Lynn. Now, Mr. Lasserve from Peterborough, when he went out to America with his family some years ago, flew over to the island of Bermuda, which you see here, the blue part, and all around it is this huge reef, and the actual end of the island is known as the Devil's Island, and this was where John Rolfe from our village went out with his ship, the Sea Venture, and they were shipwrecked on July the 26th, 1609, but no lives were lost. They were very lucky. They had these tremendous storms, and they managed to scramble ashore and landed on Gates Bay, and they set up a little settlement on the island there, building little houses and a church, which was run by the Reverend Buck, and they had stores, and they rebuilt the two ships and eventually carried on their journey. They were very lucky to be shipwrecked in such a nice place because there was plenty of food and there was fresh water and quite a pleasant climate. In fact, it was so nice there that many of the settlers did not want to carry on their journey onto Jamestown. They actually wanted to stay and remained there. And Mr. Lasserve also has lent me this very interesting book, which was written in 1962 by Mr. F. Van Wyck Mason, and it's called The Sea Venture. It is actually a novel, but it is written in a historical way, telling the story of this shipwreck, and it's quite an entertaining read. It's written in old-fashioned, oldie-worldy language, but it is historically fairly accurate. John Rolfe was married at that time to another lady. We don't know her name, but they did have a baby, and they baptised the baby Bermuda, a little girl, naming her after the island. And apparently she died on the island. And also, we don't know what happened to his wife. She just disappears out of the story. I received a very nice letter back from the island of Bermuda, sent to me from Bermuda Archives, the Government Administration Building in Hamilton on the islands. And I was asking them about the family of the John Rolfe family and his wife and the child Bermuda. And this is what they replied. Unfortunately, Although our records do start in the 17th century, we have no primary sources from the period before the Bermuda Company. Our secondary sources appear to indicate the child Bermuda was a girl. There is no mention of Rolfe's wife's name. But for more information, perhaps you'd like to contact the Bermuda Maritime Museum. And they also have some interesting diving books on scuba diving about the wreck of the Sea Venture, which was here. And people do dive down and find the wreck now. And they've also sent me some interesting photocopies about the story. I haven't had a chance to read them yet, but the first one is entitled Bermuda Settlers of the 17th Century, Genealogical Notes, written by Julian Mercer. And then we've got Bermuda Today and Yesterday from 1503 to 1973. I presume that 1503 was when it was first inhabited by people. So it's not that long really in time. Then this is about the Isle of Devils, Bermuda under the Somers Island Company. Captain Somers was the captain of the ship that landed there and was shipwrecked in 1609. And this is the one about the story of Bermuda and her people. But it will be a very interesting place to visit, and I'd like to try and find out next whether they have anything in the churches there that have been left behind. They apparently built a church called St George's Church where Bermuda was baptised. I'd like to know if it's still there or whether there's any remains and ruins of the church, and also whether they have any nice stained glass windows in their modern churches on the island today. Now, two other visitors that we've had this summer, a gentleman called John Noel from Nottingham, who used to live in London as a student at university and was very interested in the story of John Smith and John Rolfe and Pocahontas. He visited early summer and said that he'd actually just seen that week the new cartoon film made by Walt Disney called Pocahontas, which is the second one, telling the rest of the story. And that had just been released on August the 25th in the United States of America. We expect the video to reach the UK next spring, and I guess there'll be many more visitors next year, possibly more children and families, coming to find out about the Heacham connection to the story. We also had another lady from Milton Keynes who left her name and address, and she's actually bought a little cottage very close to the bank in our village and will be coming here now as a holiday visitor. And she has a friend in Washington DC who's very, very friendly with Chief Curtis Costello. And she's hoping that her friend will be able to make contact with the chief, and perhaps he will be able to send us more information about the Indian life in America and the tribe of the Mattapony Indians. And she's also said that her relative visits Jamestown quite often and will be able to take more photographs for us to put in the display. So that's great news and very exciting. We look forward to hearing more about them next year. So the whole jigsaw puzzle is growing fast, and it's very interesting. And I guess when the Pocahontas video comes out in the UK next year, then maybe we shall see more on the television explaining this very interesting story to the children.